This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guests, legendary promoter Nick Panaseiko and Bob Klanac, author of Promo Man, Backstage Tales from the Vinyl Jungle. If you've never heard of Nick Panaseiko, that's entirely understandable. He was a backstage guy, making sure that the act on stage is playing to a full house, making sure their records were on the radio and in record stores. He was a promo man. Kelly Jay of Crowbar referred to the Canadian music industry of the era as a matter of 6 degrees of Nick Panaseiko. Taking off from a popular Panasonic ad campaign of the day, legendary rocker Ronnie Hawkins dubbed him Nick Panaseiko, a man slightly ahead of his time. And at his induction into the Jack Richardson Hall of Fame, Alice Cooper, Ronnie Hawkins, and Peter Criss of Kiss all sent video tributes. Promo Man places Nick in the zeitgeist of the music industry in the 60s and 70s, and his work with the acts who were, and in some cases still are, the aural soundtrack to our lives. How Nick made his way to the epicenter of the Canadian music industry and made his way out alive is the story of Promo Man. It takes the reader from the 17-year-old kid who booked the Supremes to a sold-out show, through his success breaking Kiss in Canada, to his time with Quality Records and WEA in the 70s. While Nick's métier was promoting acts, his other duties as assigned, including finding Freddie Mercury and Liberace Toronto gay bars, playing board games with young Marlon Richards, finding cocaine for his father Keith and Ronnie Wood, having to deal with a racist Bill Cosby, being the de facto minder for Keith Moon at a party, and being an extra in a Van Halen video. This book truly lives in his tales of a breakneck lifestyle, working with and promoting acts including Queen, Liberace, The Cars, Van Halen, and finally, the Rolling Stones. This is an insider's look at the freewheeling times of the Canadian music industry as it came into being, told by the consummate insider. Key to the book are the many photographs by acclaimed rock and roll photographer John Rowlands of Nick with artists including Debbie Harry, Donna Summer, Kiss, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Johnny Cash, Liberace, Keith Moon, and Freddie Mercury. The fast pace of the narrative coupled with the photos brings to life a much mythologized time in popular music. To tell Nick Panaseiko's story is author Bob Klanac, a Canadian music journalist who has penned hundreds of reviews and interviews. Among them, Levon Helm, John Mayer, Garth Hudson, Bill Wyman, Chris Cornell, Johnny Winters, and many, many more. He was a juror for the Polaris Music Prize and is currently a member of the Slate Family Polaris Heritage Prize jury and a Juno Awards juror. To hear a playlist of the bands and artists discussed in this episode, head over to the show notes page. Nick and Bob, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's great to talk to you about this book. I really enjoyed it. I want to start with you, Bob. How did you end up teaming up with Nick to do this project?
It really all started a number of years ago. I was writing for a magazine in London here, and they tasked me with doing a history of London music, as I called it, a history of London music brutally condensed to 1,200 words, because that was it. But one of the things that kept coming up was people kept saying, we talked to Nick Panaseiko, we talked to Nick Panaseiko. You see, I wasn't from London, and Nick was ubiquitous in London in the 60s and 70s. And so I finally did talk to Nick, and I started getting an idea of what he did in London and why he had such a reputation. So you flash forward ahead a number of years, and I think it was the mid-2000 and like 2015 or so, I was the chair of the Home County Festival here in London, and I ran into Nick at the festival, and he was, hey, we should get together. So we started talking, and one night I got him out for some beverages with a couple other friends of mine, and I pitched him on, I said, you got someone to write this book you're talking about? And he said, no. And he said, how about you? And I said, okay, I'm in. And that's how it started. That was about 4 years ago.
Nick, can you take us back to the beginning? You grew up in Canada, London, Ontario. At what point did you realize that this was a career you wanted to pursue?
Well, I can only take you back to when I finally thought I was going to be a rock star. And that was going to be in about 1955 or 56 when I was 10 years old. But I unfortunately realized to be a rock star, you had to play a guitar or drums. Neither one of them I really was interested in, especially guitar. You had to have calluses on your fingers to be able to play the chords. So I decided that I'd take another route, and I would promote a band or a talent that I felt was worthy of being shared with others. So I went through all that, plus the fact that I had a great job at a place called the Disc Shop in the Wellington Square Mall in London, which was your basic Google computer knowledge. You came by the disc shop to find out the latest dance, bought your tickets, bought your latest 45, picked up your latest top 10 chart, and so on and so forth. So
yeah, you found out it was like almost like a community center in terms of information about music. You know, who's coming to town, what's going on. Now we have it on our phones. And back then, Nick was not just the disc shop, but Nick was the guy at the disc shop who kind of made it this kind of ubiquitous, whoops, I used the word twice now, place to go to find out what's going on in London and Toronto and places.
Yeah, and you got the pictures of Nick in here from back in the day working, I believe. You got some shots of him at that shop too, I believe. Mm-hmm. A lot of great pictures in here. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's you with Wayne Newton.
Yeah.
Yes, that was my first major interview when I left Decca Records and became the buyer for the Metropolitan stores, the record department in London. And I'll tell you that in those days, it was very rare that a record company or anybody else would sponsor an act. It was usually a radio station promotion.
Bob, you talk about Nick's early days in the business in London, Ontario, where he was organizing teen hops, and he was already getting some competition. People knew about him when he was just a teenager.
He was the guy. I think he also startled people because of his energy, to the point where some of the big players in town kind of did their best to shut him out. He was 17 when he had a success bringing the Supremes to town, for example, and they didn't take too kindly to that. So they did their best they kind of tapped the union on the shoulder and said, this guy can't be doing this. So the union kind of put an embargo on him doing that. But of course, Nick being Nick, he pivoted and said, okay, I can't book bands in London, fine. And so he took all of his bookings out of town to like Grand Band and Exeter and Lucan, anywhere else he could. It didn't stop him, which is, I think, key. I don't think you ever, Nick, ever said, nope, I can't do that. Oh, well. You always...
But the only competition we started to have was with Wonderland. And that, of course, came on the heels of me making a deal with Charles Jones, the father of Don and Chuck at Wonderland. And they started running dances against me whenever I had a major event come in. They would do an all-girls free event trying to shut us down.
And what was interesting about that whole thing, too, is that you could read the book. Nick went to Don Jones Sr., whose kids are basically still big players in London still. He went to Don Jones Sr. and said, hey, you're not doing anything in the Wonderland Gardens on certain nights. How about I bring in some bands? So he went to Toronto, met with this agent. What was his name again, Nick?
Ron Scribner.
He ran one of the biggest agencies in Toronto. Nick saw these acts ranging from James...
from the Mandela to, at that time, I was trying to get the group that had the major hit called Charlena.
So he had all these acts lined up that he could bring in. And then Don Jones Sr. said, you know what, that's a great idea. I'm going to have my sons do it. So he kind of took that away from him. And that was unfortunate.
Nick, I want to ask you about your days working at the record shop in the mall. This is where you create a magazine called Soul Sauce. Can you talk about that?
Soul Sauce was a freebie, and the magic for Soul Sauce was that we would get a couple thousand printed and we'd drop them off at different high schools in the lunchroom, knowing that they'd be circulated. The only other avenue that you had to advertise the event of those days was the London Free Press, which of course is a paid ad. And if you got a disc jockey involved, you had to buy some advertising too. So Soul Sauce filled that gap. It was a bunch of reprints from Billboard magazine and spotlighting some of the local talent in town, plus, of course, the event. So I said we had an issue come out every month or every time we had a major event come up.
Was this kind of stuff always going on in your mind as you're working? Because an average retail position, the average person who's working the average retail position, they don't think of these types of things all the time. But were you always just thinking about ways to promote?
Well, my bottom line was always put the spotlight on the talent. So whatever I come up with in bringing the spotlight to the talent, like leading to the Kiss story, which, we'll talk about dressing up poor kids at Christmas time. So,
Well, let's get to that. I actually, when I read through the book and set up the questions, I'm thinking, boy, I don't want to ask too many Kiss questions because there's so much in there. But I love Kiss, Nick. I'm a huge Kiss fan. There's Van Halen 1 and there's Kiss 2. So I have to ask you about Kiss quite often throughout this interview. Some great shots of you with the band, one on the cover. Chapter 5 titled A Perfect Kiss. In 1973, you were called on to help boost the listenership of a radio station in Windsor called CJOM. This station is very close to Detroit, Michigan. That's Detroit Rock City, right? This was a gig that ultimately led you to your dream job. What happens here?
well, here I would take a pile of LPs across the border to Detroit because that was our major market to cater to, and give them out to people in the major stores. At that time, you had the boutique shops, and they would then tune your station into the music that they played all day. We'd give them a bunch of albums to give away. And of course, Kiss at the time was just coming on the scene. They were a band out of New York that played CBGBs and a bunch of low-life small venues, and bringing them to Detroit with CJOM getting behind them. The people that write about Kiss right now don't ever mention the fact that CJOM FM, if it wasn't for that radio station that broke them into Detroit and Windsor and London, Ontario, I don't think Kiss or Rush would have made it. Two bands that had a great talent, but the fact that they finally came together with the booking that I did in 1974. I went out to see Kiss that night, 1974. It was around February. We went out to see the band. We started with David Bowie doing his Stardust routine. Then we went to see a band called Bullets that eventually became the Romantics. And then finally at a hockey arena, we went to see Kiss, who at that time had just started in their early days of makeup, homemade costumes, and having Peter Criss's drums lifted into the air by a forklift truck.
Yeah, that's wild.
One thing I really like about this is the serendipity of Nick having Rush on the same bill as Kiss for one of those shows that he did, and that being this key point where they met, realized they really liked each other, and then Kiss said, come on along the road with us in the States. You can open for us. And of course, that was key towards Rush being exposed to kind of metal audiences who took to them. And that was kind of the big push for them.
Of course, because we at that time at CJOM FM were looking for a mascot for the station. And we had a choice of Aerosmith, New York Dolls, or Kiss. We chose Kiss because of the crazy costumes and knowing that they were borrowing from the New York Dolls and Alice Cooper at the time. With the popularity of CJOM, ended up forcing stations in Detroit and Windsor, especially a station called CKLW in Windsor, to play Kiss. And consequently, they ended up selling out Cobo Hall for 3 consecutive dates, which was unheard of.
When you first saw Kiss perform, did you see what they were going to go on to become by the end of the decade?
I saw Barnum and Bailey circus act, and I'll tell you that, yeah, they were loud and proud. They definitely put on a show. And what they combined with their show is the pyrotechnics and just the enthusiasm that they showed on stage. My only issue with Kiss is that in today's world, everybody has a version of Kiss. Unfortunately, I only believe in the original Kiss group, and not to put any downs on any other beliefs with the different people they replaced over the years. But if you've got a group called Kiss, then you've got Kiss. If you've got a group called Kiss, you're missing 2 members. I don't know, I think you've got a karaoke act.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. There are a lot of people that still prefer that original lineup of Paul, Gene, Ace, and Peter. And you played a big role in helping the band take off and become what they eventually became by the late 70s.
In the early days when we combined them with Rush, they had a fantastic night. And of course, we brought them back 5 months later for the Merry Christmas show. Merry Christmas, the phrase that I coined And of course, still waiting for my check from Gene Simmons. But
Yeah, no check from Gene yet.
the reality of the whole package was that Kiss was building on a ongoing package that sold to a dedicated audience. And that's where the Kiss Army was formed. And they had all the props from a marketing company that was run by a guy called Guy Coyne, who did the Dr. Pepper commercials and launched a lot of brands. And Guy Coyne was the mastermind behind what Kiss was going to do in the future years, including being signed to Casablanca Records.
How were the guys in the band getting along at that time? Because as we know, things started to fall apart as we get to the mid to late 70s. How were they at that time, around 73, 74?
Well, I'll tell you, Backstage, the record company's picking up the tab. Everybody's happy. You couldn't really see any tension or anything else. Everybody was happy.
Yeah, and ultimately, and unfortunately, for those who loved that early lineup, it didn't last.
Well, that's exactly what happens when you've got money involved, stardom involved, and everything going for you. But all of a sudden, you've got some discourse in the band. I believe Peter was let go first, and then Ace followed that.
There's another good story in the book, Nick, about Kiss playing during a big snowstorm. Do you remember this?
Well, in 1974, we've got Kiss coming back for a date in December. So I dress up 4 kids as Kiss. We hire a limousine, a photographer, and we do a run in and run out of radio stations and record stores, taking pictures. The buzz goes out among the London crowd that Kiss was in town, and that's the week before the show. The show is sponsored by a store called Peek and Seek, and it's a snowy Sunday where trucks aren't allowed to travel on the 401. We had to get a special permit.
And now Peek and Seek, though, was one of these glam stores, wasn't it, Nick? Like they sold glam clothing, right?
Well, that was the era at that time.
Yeah.
Everybody was into satins and 8-inch platform shoes. Consequently, the band is late. We've got London Arena booked. We've got kids there on a Sunday night with their parents expecting to pick them up at 10 o'clock. And the band arrives at about 9:10. In the meantime, the opening act, Joe, has extended their set twice over. I get into a major battle and discussion with Alan Miller, who's the road manager, who's telling me that we got to clear the hall so Kiss can do a sound check. I said, no way, these kids have already stood outside. We let them early as it is. Regardless, finally Kiss comes on. The horns are honking outside. Parents are there to pick up the kids. At least a third of the kids have to leave because their parents are there to pick them up at 10. And the London Free Press does a major story hidden in the entertainment section saying, Kiss is loud, they're going nowhere.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you worked with Kiss again in 1975. Their label Casablanca was on the verge of bankruptcy. Their Canadian distributor Quality Records called on you, Nick, to help promote the band?
In 1974, when I brought that group in for Merry Christmas, Gene Lou, who was the director of promotion for Quality, saw my talents with doing the makeup with the kids, the limos and whatever. He called me a year later when they got the contract with Casablanca for distribution and wanted me to come on board. Of course, I had to think about that because I had a family in London and I would now be gone Monday to Thursday. So I took the challenge and said, yes, I'll be there. That was the beginning of the dollars and cents that Casablanca raised, a couple $1 million to do the Destroyer album and the other albums coming up.
And there's the story about Ace and Peter going fishing with you. What's this one about?
Well, it was in 1976. Kiss played their first date as a major act in London. And it was a Saturday night, and Sunday they had the day off. So we consequently decided that they wanted to do something different. Peter and Ace wanted to go fishing. Paul and Gene wanted to play baseball. So I accommodated both of them. I got a group of baseball players together for Gene and Paul. And I took my son, who was 3 at that time, going on 4, Jay Panaseiko, to Fanshawe Dam in London, Ontario, to go fishing. They ended up getting out of a limo, surrounded by a bunch of people without makeup. Nobody knew who they were. And they ended up wandering right into the river in their $300 snakeskin boots and designer jeans.
Love that story.
To not catch anything.
We also have to keep in mind, this was when nobody knew what these guys looked like, and you were able to see them without the makeup. What were their personalities like off stage?
Everybody had their own persona. I think I got the closest to Paul Stanley of anybody. I could run into Gene tomorrow and he probably wouldn't know who I am, but that's Gene in his own way. Ace, last time I spoke to Ace, he was playing at a club in Toronto, and we had a great time. And then, of course, Peter Criss, of all people, really remembered his time with me in London when he came to the London Rockathon at the London Music Hall. And then I gave him a tour of the London Music Hall of Fame, where we had the gold records and the second contract for $2,000 on display. And of course, with Casablanca Records distributed by Quality, I had a nice expense account, so we did some major promotion for them when they were in Toronto. In fact, the other person that I gave a launch to in Toronto at that time was Mickle Body Rock, who is the Canadian champion for weightlifting, and he became Thor. I introduced him to Gene, and they took a bunch of pictures together, which of course propelled Thor into a different spectrum.
Is this the same Thor that was the musician Thor?
This is a musician Thor that had one major hit, if you call it a hit, Who Let the Dogs Out.
Yeah, okay. Promo Man, Backstage Tales from the Vinyl Jungle is out now. You became close with the late, great Chuck Berry. Bob, you set up Nick's story by talking about one of the truisms in rock and roll in the late 60s, early 70s. Always have cash on hand to pay Chuck Berry at your gig. Can you talk about this? I've heard this said of Chuck before.
That's just been true for years. I mean, I think even up to when Keith Richards did that film with him, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, money was up front for that. Nick and I have discussed it, and I think it's basically because, once bitten, twice shy. You go into a bar and you're going to play a gig or something, and at the end of the night, a couple of guys say, hey, it's, whatever, they just stiff him, right? So he always did that. And there's a story in the book about he was playing a hall in Toronto, and the people who were putting him on were students and had not heard of this. And so Chuck says, no cash, no check, no gig. So Nick had to run to the people he knew at Sam the Record Man, which is a big record retailer in Canada. And they cashed his check for him and got him the cash, and he went on stage.
In defense of Chuck, he got ripped off in the early days, and that was his way of going about business. How about that showdown with him and Keith Richards in that documentary, man? Whoa.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Chuck traveled with his suit bag and his guitar, and the first thing he asked for was the cash. He didn't care whether the show had started or was 2 hours before. When he arrived, show me the cash, no show. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I think Bob talked about the fact that he had a lover in Kitchener, Ontario, where he had invested some money in some townhouses, and I ended up driving him to Kitchener to collect some money, and he delivered it to the lady that he was supposedly married to or unmarried to.
Yeah.
So he was quite a character.
Did he have a manager, or was he just handling all of his own business?
He handled everything. He didn't trust anybody. And I was amazed that we became such good friends, and actually came back to my house after a show at HBO Tech High School in London. Unfortunately, brought along a young girl that we thought was 18 who ended up being 17 or 16. We ended up having to send her home in a cab, and Chuck followed not that long after.
And he lived a long life, and he was playing for a while. I mean, he played into his 80s, didn't he? I had a friend who went to go see him perform, and at that time, he was in his 80s, I think.
Yeah, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, still doing the duck walk.
Yeah.
Yes, he was.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Nick, you worked with Blondie, who would go on to become huge. But, Bob, I want to ask you, you're right that for every Blondie, there were others that continued to bubble under and never break through. Who are some of the bands and artists that make that list? And are there any that you were a fan of and surprised that didn't make it? There was one band called Symphonic Slam that you write a full chapter on.
Yeah, well, Nick was friends with one of the, I think it was the manager in the band, wasn't it, Nick?
Yeah, Terry Shepard.
What did Symphonic Slam sound like? What type of band were they?
They're prog rock. They're more like Yes, or you have to hear the album. I tell you, Timo Lane, who headed up the group, played the first synthesizer guitar. Treat Yourself and put on a couple of cuts by Symphonic Slam, and you'll hear how progressive they were.
One of the things that won't come through those is the context, and I think it's referred to in the book, and I think, Nick, you mentioned it as well, but quite frankly, disco was on the rise, and basically the label wanted everyone to go disco if they could, to get on some of that. And I think they did that with Symphonic Slam, and it just didn't work. Is that right, Nick?
Exactly.
But Nick gave it a good shot, and he got them distributed through Quality.
They were originally signed to A&M Records, and that was through Ray Daniels, who was the manager of Rush. Ray had heard the tape by Symphonic Slam and introduced it to A&M Records and said, here's somebody you should take a serious look at, which they did. And they ended up signing Symphonic Slam, plus did a major promotion where they offered a $299 ticket for a sold-out show at Massey Hall in December, about 2 days before Christmas.
Any other bands that you could think of, Bob, that should have made it, never did?
One of my favorites at the time was Robert Gordon and Link Wray, and that was one of Nick's acts. They even had a song written for them by Bruce Springsteen, who was doing well, and I named Fire.
Okay.
In fact, he gave it to him first. He did it, and then the Pointer Sisters did it after him. And it's too bad. It's a good version. And Link Wray's, of course, the guy with the song The Rumble, that whole guitar sound. And that kind of rockabilly thing was happening, but it just wasn't happening as big as disco and a million other things. He still tours around. I saw him a couple of years ago, and Link Wray for that matter. So
you mentioned another Canadian artist in the book, Kim Mitchell. There was a song that there was a radio station here in Connecticut, in New Haven, Connecticut, WPLR. When I was growing up, they played Go for a Soda. You remember that?
one?
Why not go for a soda? Nobody hurts. Nobody dies. So it was like a pro. You don't need to drink. Have a soda.
Yeah.
It's the only song I ever heard played by him here in the States. But in Canada, he's got quite a following, right?
Well, yeah. I don't know. Wouldn't you think, Nick? I mean, Patio Lanterns was huge. His solo career was big.
I basically gave Kim Mitchell a start, too.
Yeah?
He originated with a band called The Grass Company out of Sarnia, Ontario. And I had him open for a couple of our shows in London at the London Arena. And, of course, he went on to Max Webster and other pre-bands after him becoming a solo act. He also had a radio show on Q107 for quite some time.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Go for Soda, 1984. I'm looking it up here, and it was a
Good
hit
one.
here, number 86 on the Billboard Hot 100. I don't know if he had any other U.S. singles.
Was Patio Lanterns not big there?
No, you're right. Patio Lanterns was even bigger, top 40.
Oh, it was. Okay, yeah. No, it was.
But for some reason, that was never played on any of the local rock stations. But Go for Soda was. There was only one station that would play it. None of the others. Yeah, it's funny. I just remember that.
That's funny.
Nick, so many amazing musicians you worked with, hung out with, and the pictures are all in this book. You hanging out with Keith Moon, Kiss, of course, Debbie Harry, Frankie Valli, Muddy Waters, Jose Feliciano, Donna Summer, the list goes on and on. Is there one particular person that, I don't know if it would say it was your favorite to work with or any that just stands out to work with and hang out with?
Well, I'm glad you use the word work, because a lot of people figure that you're a groupie when you're in charge of a band. But the bottom line is you've got a job and you're getting paid for it, and your day may start mine usually started about 11 in the morning and ended at 3 a.m. sometimes. But of all the bands or groups or people that I really worked with, that I really enjoyed and had a great personal relationship was, of all things, Mickey Gilley, who had his stardom from Urban Cowboy being filmed at Gilley's, a huge country bar in Texas. And the other one from the other spectrum was Liberace. And Libby used to remember my last name, Nick Panaseiko, and that I had a couple of kids, and he would talk to me about my family whenever we got together. So that all came about through management of Seymour Heller that managed Liberace.
Wow, that's cool.
As far as rock and roll bands go, yes, I organized the press party for that particular night, where my partner at that time, Jim Soupy Campbell, handles other acts. We'd have press parties at the Alma Combo. We'd do the presentations of gold and platinum records like we did for Queen and Freddie Mercury. In fact, I think that the going story with Freddie and I is he introduced me to steak tartare, which is still my favorite whenever I get a chance to find a place that serves it, because it's raw meat, but I really enjoy it.
There's good pictures of Nick and Freddie Mercury in the book, too. One of the things I really enjoyed writing was just about how Nick kind of kept Freddie and Liberace secret at the time, because it wouldn't have been good for business if it was known that they were, in fact, gay. And so Nick set up these parties for him at these gay clubs in Toronto, and the gay community really welcomed them with open arms. And I think Freddie appreciated that.
Didn't one of Freddie's friends make a move on you, Nick? Or what was that story in the book?
That was Gino Impri. Gino was gay also. And of course, we went to a place called Charlie's, a gay club which was up above the gasworks in Toronto on Yonge Street. And Gino comes up to me and says, "Listen, do you mind if we dance together and I give you a kiss? Because you're the fresh chicken stud here." So I said, "Hey, Gino, if I'm that good looking, I'm ready to do whatever you need."
Oh, man, that's great. Freddie Mercury, what a talent, outrageous personality, flamboyant. I can't even imagine what it must have been like just being in his presence, because we see the movie on him and you see him in video. It's like he didn't even exist. He's larger than life, and there he was right in front of you. Yeah. What about Keith Moon? There's another one. There's a story right up front in that book where you were hanging out with Keith Moon, which turned out to be the last Who concert with Keith. This is in October of 76. Can you talk about that night?
Well, that was a crazy night. My promotion man from Quality Records, who ended up leaving Quality and had hired me, opened a club called Cooley's. It became the kind of private club, restaurant, bar for promotion parties. So, of course, the crew from Keith Moon's gang threw the party for him. And Gene Lou, who owned the club, called me and said, "Can you come out and give me a hand? We got Keith here, who has been known to do everything from throwing televisions out the door to outrageous behavior. You come and entertain him." So I end up meeting Keith, and within about 20 minutes, Keith says, "I've got a problem here. I'm being watched. We've got to find a spot to bag of, well, I didn't know it was a bag of cocaine at the time."
Yeah.
You go into the washroom, and he says, "We're not leaving here till this is all gone." So bottom line, I had it coming out of my ears and my nose and my throat.
This is a good time to touch on something that you've already picked up on, Eric, in the book, the photos. It was a really nice bit of serendipity. Like Nick met his good friend John Rowlands.
Yeah, I want to make sure we mention him too. Yeah, John Rowlands.
Yeah, because Nick really liked his work and hired him to do this. And so he would show up at all these events. So that's why we have Nick's life as well documented by the photos of John Rowlands. The other part is that Yeah, that's
in the
the one.
all-white suit there, Keith Moon wearing.
And that was right after they left the washroom. Like John was just outside the washroom in the back of the kitchen. And that's the picture. And Keith's got that kind of like regal look about it. You know, that Keith Moon look?
He's got his arm around you, Nick.
But also, that's the thing. So it wasn't just that he took pictures of Nick's events, but he brought Nick along to other things. And so that's how Nick ended up in pictures like the one with the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, you know? And the idea was that, and it started getting around, I think they both liked it. It's like, who is this guy, right? Who's this guy in there with Trudeau? And it's Nick.
I love it. Yeah, you were everywhere and with everyone, Nick.
And I got paid.
Yeah, and you got paid too. Yes. Well, yeah, that's the thing I want to ask about. What was one of the gigs there that I can't imagine it was at all work? I'm trying to remember which one that was. That was, the Queen one about the Fat Bottom Girls promo that you did. You got some local exotic dancers to come in. What was that one about?
Well, we were promoting Fat Bottom Girls. The album was called Jazz. Trying to figure out how are we going to tie the two titles together with. So we had a big sticker with Jazz that I taped across my bare chest, and I hired two strippers from down the road from a club called the Zanzibar. And we were open for two things. One was to get arrested by the police so we'd make some national press, and two, just to draw a crowd.
And just if I could just add the one thing, Nick got the idea because if you open up Jazz, it shows a picture of all these fat bottom girls, topless women on bicycles in the gatefold of the album.
That was the setup for the whole show.
Any of them flirt with you, Nick?
Well, not that afternoon. Once again, like I said, it's a job. You look after them. We gave them their $100 each, and the girls got dressed before the police arrived, which of course spoiled the other part of what we were trying to accomplish. But hey, it was a great afternoon. And that night we ended up having a major press party at a place called Bigelardi's, which was one of the top restaurants in London, and they say Toronto.
And wasn't it also that they all knew Freddie was coming, so they all put on the sailor caps that he was wearing?
Well, the word went out at the press parties with Freddie that all the gay clubs know that they should be wearing leather vests or little Greek caps. That was his calling at the time.
Now, some of the context there is that Toronto had a reputation back in the day as Toronto the Good. If you look up the phrase, that was kind of a thing, and this perception that Toronto, with its Anglo-Saxon background, was much more prudish about things. And things like the gay culture were very underground. And that's kind of part of the context of why the police would come, because they would probably address it at the time for, I guess, public indecency or something, I guess.
In those days, of course, music critics were very highly respected. I mean, Peter Goddard with the Toronto Star could make or break an act. And Toronto really responded very quickly to criticism or accolades. So, yeah, that's why we head for the story of Keith Richards.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to that one, too. But what about John Belushi? There's another guy like Keith Moon. Died before his time. Your experience with him goes back to before he was on Saturday Night Live. John was a member of the National Lampoon radio show, and John invited you to hang out with him. What was that like?
Well, he played Fryfogels in 1974.
In London.
In Ontario. And of course, after having our pictures taken the night of the concert with Kilda Radner and Bill Murray and everybody, the next day he invited me up to his room at the Hotel London and walked into the room, and I knew something was different about this room. It was 2 p.m, and it felt like it was blacked out. I took a look at the windows, and he had taped up swimming pool liner with the gaffer tape and had it blacked out. So I was surprised. We smoked enough hash. I stumbled home. I was amazed that he was able to go back on stage.
Oh, my God.
It's hilarious.
Wow.
There's a bit of a sadness, too, to the next time. Nick, you may have run into him at the concert for the blind that the Stones put on later, but there's a couple of comments in there from Cliff Lorimer, who was the blind DJ who hosted the concerts and was involved in helping put them on. Cliff noted, though, that Belushi was just out of control, drunk on stage, and it was just an embarrassment. And you can kind of like see the beginning of the end for Belushi.
Belushi wanted him to introduce a band as the terrible asshole band.
Yeah, that's in the book. What year would this be then? This is around 76 or no, 70.
78,
Nine? Was it 9 or 78 or 79? I can't
78,
remember.
79,
Yeah.
But the first time then would have been pre-SNL, so that has to be like 75, or I can't remember when the first season.
74, I think.
Yeah, because the first season of
74.
SNL, 74.
SNL, I think, started, the beginning of 75, I think it was?
Yeah, so you were
But
there,
still, yeah.
Nick, right before he's about to break big, and then you're there towards the end. I think when he died in 81, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, you got a
He was
Bill
not-
Cosby story in this book that at one time would be a complete shock, but now in light of what we know, not so much. How did you end up working with him, and can you talk about what went down that night? I have to imagine this is probably like your least favorite person to work with of all these guys.
Well, it was a great evening. It was a hot evening at the C&E. The band that I was representing was the Spinners, but also we had Bill Cosby. So we decided to buy Cosby a nice box of Cuban cigars. We ended up presenting him with the cigars. He pulls me aside and says, "Hey, I want these end guys out of my trailer as soon as possible." So, of course, then I have to be polite to the Spinners and tell them that Bill's getting ready for a show. Can we leave? They leave. He comes back up to me and says, "I don't ever want you to book me back or have anybody book an end group opening for me,"
Man,
which totally shocked me at the time.
wow.
He was vulgar, very vulgar.
I tried to explain from my thoughts why he might have done that in terms of his career, because he was trying to, I think, see himself. I think he and Sidney Poitier in their time were the acceptable black faces for America, you know? I don't think he liked to be associated with his race. I don't think he wanted to be lumped in as, yeah, it's Bill Cosby, you got to get a black group opening. And it doesn't excuse him saying what he did. That was disgusting.
We're talking with author Bob Klanac and legendary promoter Nick Panaseiko. Promo Man, Backstage Tales from the Vinyl Jungle is the book. The Rolling Stones get quite a bit of ink in this book. There's one chapter where the band pulled out mid-show after not getting paid, another about a problem promoting the 1978 album Some Girls due to its album cover, another on Keith Richards paying and playing for his crime. So the listeners can read about those stories in the book. But I want to ask you about when the Stones came to Toronto in February of 1977. Bob, as you write, this is one of the quote-unquote other duties as assigned common to promo men in the 70s. Bob, I'll throw it to you first. Set up this story here. What happens here?
I love this story because basically Nick's job is to, make the band happy. And at the time, that involved a lot of things. I mean, I think we all know the story of Keith and Anita get busted. Well, Anita gets busted at the Toronto airport first when they're all coming to town. They're all coming to town to find studios to record their next album and also do some live shows.
Anita Pallenberg, right?
Yes, Anita Pallenberg, Keith's wife. And so that was the context. They were going to do some live shows, secret shows, and you could do secret shows back then at the El Macombo Tavern. And so Anita gets busted first, and Keith doesn't have much on him. So then they end up arranging a bust where they're staying at the Harbor Castle Inn. And so they're both charged with heroin possession. But what do you do if you've got someone who's hooked on heroin? You have to get him more heroin, right? Now, that wasn't Nick's job, as is pointed out in the book. Keith had this guy named Lance Irwin, a mysterious figure who always arranged to make sure there's some heroin available to Keith. And one of my favorite bits is there's a woman, Keith's, I think, assistant or something, Barbara Strone, who pulls Nick into an elevator at one point at the Harbor Castle. And they have those cigarette ashtrays they used to have outside the elevator. So they pull one in. Barbara says, "Give me a boost." And Nick gives her a boost. She goes up the ceiling tile of the elevator in the Harbor Castle and pulls down a bag of heroin. Where else are you going to hide heroin?
Yeah.
In plain sight.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? In plain sight. And so then Nick had set up the cocaine thing. He didn't actually touch the drugs. He just sort of said, "Here's a guy," and he talked to someone else and said, "Okay, you're going to go there and pick it up." And he kind of made sure that happens because cocaine was Ronnie's thing. And even if you can't get heroin, cocaine's the next best thing.
Keith and Ronnie were partying hard together. And then when Ronnie got sober, Keith said, "Well, I got to find a new drinking partner." And then I think the quote from in Rolling Stone interview, he says, "Well, I am my own drinking partner."
Good.
Gotta love Keith. Yes.
Anyway,
Crazy.
that's one part of the book I really liked, and I really liked writing because it's really got that feel of, okay, we got to do this. We got also, Nick is going down to the rehearsals that they were doing at, I think, at the Palais Royal. Wasn't it, Nick, down on the lakeshore?
On the lakeshore, in an abandoned warehouse.
Okay, yeah. So they were doing rehearsals down there, and he would go check in with them and also trying to get the paperwork done so that Keith and Lance, he had to basically get Keith back across the border and do some paperwork with the government.
They went in where he stole the picture of himself out of the file. We don't want to give too much away from the book because we're going to tell the whole story here.
Exactly. We'll leave the listeners in suspense. They can read the rest of that story in the book. I'm a big Cars fan, and Nick, you helped the band promote their classic debut album from 1978, and this involves you dressing up in a mechanic suit.
We dressed up as mechanics, and it took the music directors from different stations for a ride in the limo, where we would stop in the middle of Yonge Street in Toronto, put the hood up, in the mechanic suits, looking like a breakdown, and waiting for somebody to hopefully get a picture of us, or if we got the pictures, to submit to, at that time, to RPM magazine.
You're also giving out albums or something on the spot too, weren't you?
Well, we gave out albums later up the road at Bloor and Yonge, the busiest intersection in Toronto.
Yes.
Where we hired a chicken to bounce in and out of traffic, playing chicken with the cars.
Yeah, that's just great. It's almost like Times Square of New York, Yonge and Bloor. And the idea, even now, of these people in chicken costumes handing out albums, just once again, headlines, police, the whole thing. That was the idea anyway.
Nick, was there ever a promotion idea that you wouldn't do?
Well, I don't know. The one that we got the most flack for was for a Canadian group called Lynx. We hired a girl called Aural Lund, who was there for the car show in Toronto. And the caption read, "The best 12 inches she's ever had." And of course, the poster ended up selling more call for the poster than the album.
What about Loverboy? Did you ever work with Loverboy?
No.
No, they're from Canada.
The biggest Canadian group that I worked with at that time was Sweet Blindness. And they did a cover tune of Cowboys to Girls. But record companies in Canada were not investing a lot of money into Canadian groups. Another group, the copy group, was a group called Wednesday. But yeah, it was really tough to get Canadian groups into the top 40.
Yeah, well, they have this CanCon regulation too. I mean, Canadian content to mandate that they do this, but as Nick's, I think we said it in the book, but they basically relegated that stuff to the midnight shift. So in other words, the CanCon stuff was on after midnight when fewer were listening. And so even though they were supporting them and saying, the radio stations, you have to play this much Canadian, it didn't really work out that well.
What were some of the stations that were really good to you, and do you have any fun radio stories to share?
Well, I personally, my biggest stories, of course, was CJOM FM out of Windsor. It beamed into Detroit, of course, London. The big thing with radio stations was the disc jockeys. In the good old days, a disc jockey from a major radio station could draw as many people as the headline act or the opening act. There was a time when disc jockeys, they were stars as much as the act that they were opening for.
CFNY you mentioned, right?
CFNY from Toronto with David Marsden.
Yeah, because Rush wrote a song about them. The Spirit of Radio is about CFNY.
Yeah. CFNY at one point, I used to listen to it when I was in Toronto around that time, 70s and 80s. They would program everything from the Sex Pistols to AC/DC. I mean, it was just, they really were programming wider than most would think of. They were really adventurous programming.
Free-form programming, yeah. Bachman Turner Overdrive was another band that Randy Bachman's from Canada, right?
Yes, he is.
Yeah. Randy went through a couple of groups after the guest through. One of them was Brave Belt, and another one was Iron Horse that really didn't get much play at all.
And you worked at least one of those records, right, Nick?
I worked the Iron Horse album.
Right.
But I'm thinking Bachman Turner Overdrive also had a song. It was inspired by a radio station, Taking Care of Business, I think. Yeah, here it is. It was inspired by a phrase that one of the DJs would say on the air. DJ Daryl B? Do you remember that, DJ?
Daryl B.
Well, this is in Vancouver, so.
Oh, okay. That's radio was more regional back then. There was no internet, so.
Yep.
But anyway, interesting. Nice bit of trivia there. Yeah.
Nick, you worked with Peter Gabriel during his early solo days and Genesis while on the Trick of the Tail tour in 1976. One of the rare groups that traveled with almost all of their family members, huh?
Very much so. And of course, Peter Gabriel drove me to Hamilton to one of my radio station appointments and back to the Toronto airport because he had 5 hours to kill. So that was a very interesting trip.
I always just liked the part where he was basically Nick's chauffeur for the day.
I know.
he wanted to drive the car, right? So it's like, why not? Sure.
That is hilarious. How was Peter during that car ride, Nick?
We had a great conversation just about normal things. What do you talk about somebody that's in the business? You're not going to be talking records or radio. We talked about family. We talked about listening to the radio as we drove, actually.
I've heard that before. People would say if you started talking drumming with Neil Peart, that would turn him off. He didn't want to talk. He certainly didn't want to hear how he was a legend, how great he was. If you talk to him about everyday stuff, motorcycles, traveling, that's when he'll talk.
Well, I didn't want to talk about it either, so I would not bring the subject up. Who wants to be talking about your job all day?
Got to ask you about my favorite band, Van Halen. They came to Canada to promote their debut album in 1978. David Lee Roth, I would think, was a promo man's dream. He brought with him his new rollerblades, and you saw that as the perfect promo idea.
Well, there we go. Once again, we chose Young Street. David Lee Roth wanted to show off his rollerblades. I'd never seen a pair. We ended up getting a ski rope, tying it to the trunk, and towing him down Young Street, once again looking for attention to try to get a little bit of exposure. But yeah, we had a great time. And then the night before the concert in London, in fact, I'm in one of their videos. I play some air drums. So I think I'm in for about 5 seconds.
Tell me about this. Yeah, you are in a video. Where can we find this video? Is it on YouTube?
This is what I'm looking for. I know it's out there. If you can find it, it's at the London Gardens in London, Ontario. Their first concert there. It was in the dressing room. I haven't done the research to find it, but if you find it, send it to me.
Oh, I've tried looking, Nick, and I can't find it. I believe you 200%, but I just haven't been able to find it because,
Well, I've seen it. So I'm wearing my silver jacket with the Warner Brothers logo on it, and I'm in the dressing room, and it's like about maybe 3 to 5 seconds.
I'm going to find this now, Nick. A lot of times, too, when these bands are on the run, right, they just have to shoot and go. And so it's not a surprise they shot part of it in London. They just have to get the damn thing done, get the footage done, and get it edited and get it out, right? So,
Nick, did you get to meet all the guys in the band from Van Halen? How much?
Very much so.
Yeah?
They were a very tight unit at the time. And, of course, like you say, David Lee Roth had all the makings of a star, from the long hair to the outrageous costumes he wore. Actually, after the show, I ended up taking David to Fry Kogel's, a local bar in London, for the last set of a band that was playing there at the time.
What about Eddie? Eddie was shy?
Eddie and the rest of them were just kind of faded away. Of course, my job was to make sure that they got to their hotel on time. So I didn't waste a lot of time when they said, yeah, we're heading back.
Did you get a chance to see the show?
You know something, most of the shows that were on, I was either backstage or in and out. I don't think I ever saw a full show other than the Eagles. When we had some prize seats, they set up some beautiful seats for us off to the side on stage at the CNE. And we ended up having to send the Eagles out in ambulances to get away from the crowd at the end of the show.
Was there ever a band or artist that you wanted to work with but never had the chance to?
That wasn't really a desire. Like, once again, it's a job, so it doesn't make a difference to me whether you're Linda Ronstadt or Etta James, who, of course, I looked after with her teeth being pulled and having a little bit of Novocaine and enjoying a great night at the Horseshoe.
Yeah. You decided to get out of the business in 1979. you say it was not only taxing mentally and physically, but there were some changes. Music video stations started popping up. That really changed things for you?
Very much so. Record companies weren't interested in investing money into videos, and yet MTV and all the other majors coming up with their different versions.
What do you think about the music business today? It's changed so much since the 70s and 80s and 90s, even early 2000s. It just keeps changing with streaming services and everything. Would you?
Today there's so much exposure. I mean, you got YouTube, you got all the different cyberspace channels to promote yourself on. I still live in lovely London, Ontario. I've got groups like Doug Vardy. I've got a girl called Megan Schroeder, who I think is one of the best in the city. She does everything from a tribute to Patsy Cline to Stevie Nicks, and then, of course, sings for a rock group called Loveless. But Megan is a unique voice, but she's up against talent from England, talent from every corner. So consequently, it's a little tougher to get exposure on a continued basis.
Yeah, how would you go about that nowadays? Because everything is splintered off. Would you try to cover every angle possible? Would you try to get, because back in those days, you'd get radio stations, newspapers, and then the live event or promo event. But now there's so many places. How would you go about it today?
Well, I'll tell you, the problem today is that, as you say, there's so many avenues to get it. The biggest issue is you've got to create your fan base. If you don't have a fan base, you're going nowhere. And it's a tough goal. The problem is you push a button and you switch channels. You used to do that with the push buttons on a radio in a car. But the avenues for new talent aren't cars anymore like they used to be, or 7 o'clock in the morning to your cup of coffee. I really don't know how anybody launches themselves anymore.
Yeah, where to begin, right? I remember tuning into the local rock stations that would play new music along with the classics, but I tuned in to hear what's new and if I'm going to like it. And MTV, that was during my days in high school, so that was a big thing. But still, radio was where you would be introduced to a lot of new music. It's crazy. I've said this so many times, but you know, if the Beatles came out today, I don't know what would have happened, because the Ed Sullivan Show was just, that was it. There wasn't much else to watch, and it wasn't like there were a lot of other, like if the Beatles were on a show like that today, you would have, I don't know, like 2/3 of the audience that they had that night off doing other stuff on YouTube or streaming, whatever. Video games.
Power. And I do remember seeing the Beatles on Sullivan when I was a kid. Sullivan was just this living room thing where families watched it. So to have a band like the Beatles or the Stones on Sullivan, that in itself was kind of daring. And as we all know, when they shot Elvis on Sullivan, they kept him from the waist up, right? But it was such a huge audience. Those avenues, you're right, Eric, really aren't available anymore. It's
in Canada, we had the Tommy Hunter Show.
It's another one, right?
If you wanted to make it as a country act, you had to appear in the Tommy Hunter Show.
Yeah. I mean,
earlier than that, we had Juliet.
Were there any stories that were left out of the book that almost made the book?
Not that I know of. I actually pushed for a couple. I pushed for one story to be in the book because it was so fantastic, and so it was very sympathetic to Nick. And Nick had a few problems initially. And it was the one, there's a chapter about how he got set up for a bust for marijuana. He was set up. There's a chapter, and they wanted Nick. Someone was working with the RCMP to get their sentence reduced. And so you had Nick sell him some. He said he was getting marijuana for Lighthouse or something. And so Nick set it up. And then the RCMP charged him, I think it was. And then, of course, they wanted Nick to do the same thing. And he said no. So he did a little bit of time. And now, for Canadians especially, the context is ridiculous. I can go, I don't know, less than a mile away, and I can find at least 2 cannabis shops from where I am. So that's just, I mean, Nick came off very good in that. And I pushed Nick to do it. I'm sure, Nick, you felt a little embarrassed about it at the time. But in context, you know.
Nick, are you glad
Sure.
that it's in the book? Did you have a problem initially when you had to decide to put it in the book?
No problems. I mean, I never had a chance to really discuss it as openly as I did with Bob. So consequently, the story came out the way it unfolded.
That's the thing, though, Bob, when you're writing a book, the publishers are always going to say, or like in your case, you're going to be writing it with Nick, you really have to lay it all out there, right? You got to tell some stories that might be a little difficult to share.
Yeah, I mean, and that was so long ago, too. My gosh, that was, 40 years ago? I think it was early 80s, mid 80s, I think it was.
82.
82, there we go. So, that was like 40 years ago. God knows whatever happened to the guy that set up Nick. We named him in the book. Nick hadn't initially named him, but he said to use his name, so I did. Writing the book with Nick was a dream because I always wanted him to come off looking good, and I wanted him to be comfortable with the telling of a story. On another note, late in the game, when I was already into a first draft, Nick reminded me of I think it was the Peter Tosh story, which is a great story, about Peter Tosh and going to the airport, and it was a good story.
Right. Another great story for people to check out. Got to read the book to find out what happened.
I think there's still some more stories in that head of Nick's. I may not have pried out of it.
Yeah. Well, we've only scratched the surface of what's in this book, so people need to go out and get it. It came out, I want to say, was it late 2021 it came out?
Late November, yes.
And it's available through Amazon.
Worldwide, Amazon worldwide. And from the local bookstore, just go there and request it. It's available to be ordered by any bookstore in Canada and the U.S.
Social media pages, Bob, you have. That's how I reached you on Facebook. Any social media pages you want to get out there for people to check out? The one that I reached you on is the Promo Man Facebook page, right?
Yes, it is. And there is a website that we had some problems with, but it is coming. And I won't tell you what it is right now. It's going to be called promomanbook.com or .ca. And it's just had a problem finally setting it up. But it's going to have a lot of pictures in there, too.
Yeah, I tried going there, promomanbook.com.
Well, hopefully by the time this airs,
it'll
be up.
All right. And this book, it says, was supported by the London Arts Council through the City of London's Community Arts Investment Program. You got Lost Weekend Books as the publisher. I think we covered it all. Promo Man, Backstage, Tales from the Vinyl Jungle. It's out now. Go get it. Guys, this was great.
It was great for us, too.
Beautiful night. I'm going out and I'm going to have a nice vodka martini. We're finished.
Excellent. I love it. Perfect way to end this interview. So,
of course, it's vodka. He's Ukrainian. Ukrainians do vodka. I'm telling you, it's just.
Thank you very much. Beautiful talking to you.
All right, guys.
Eric, I'm so glad we connected. Thanks again.
Thanks to Bob Klanac and Nick Panaseiko for taking us through their book, Promo Man, Backstage Tales from the Vinyl Jungle. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Nick and Bob, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our website, bookedonrock.com. Subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast. You can find us on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're a publisher or an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email or contact me through the website, bookedonrock.com. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening, and join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.